Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So this week, after a ton of requests, we are heading to Modern to play some Beatdown Elves. So I'm pretty excited about this deck. This deck is unique for Elves decks because we're not comboing off. There's no infinite mana or semi-infinite mana. There's no Court of Calling into this or that. We are mono green, we are all elves and a ton of lords, and we are just looking to beat down our opponent as quickly as possible. Probably the best way to look at Beatdown Elves is as green merfolk. That's the best comparison I can make to this deck. Is we are essentially trying to play the merfolk game as a mono green deck. We have some advantages, have some disadvantages, but essentially we are the green merfolk deck looking to do the same thing as merfolk, where we just stack up a bunch of lords, attack for a ton of damage, and win the game before our opponent has a chance to recover, wrath our board, get a Ugin down, things like that. So as you can see, $83 in the paper world, 46 ticks online. Not bad at all for the very expensive modern format. Anyway, let's break down the deck. So the key piece of Beatdown Elves is the 12 1-drops. We have 4 Elvish Mystics, 4 Llanowar Elves, and 4 Arbor Elves. And all these cards are essentially the same for our intents and purposes. Our entire mana base is basic forests, so Arbor Elf can untap every land in our deck. It only adds green mana. These are all just 1/1s for 1 that add 1 green mana. So the Merfolk deck, one of the advantages they have over the Elves deck, when you're playing the Beatdown version, is that they have 2 mana lords. They have up to 12 2-mana lords, because they have Lord of Atlantis, they have Master of the Pearl Trident, and they have Phantasmal Image if they want to copy those as another lord. So they can start playing lords on turn 2. Well, we can kind of do the same thing, but we use our mana dorks to do that. So even though our lords all cost 3 mana, we can still start playing them on turn 2 when we have a Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, or Arbor Elf on turn 1. So that's why we're playing so many of these, because we really want to make sure we can start playing our 3 mana lords on turn 2. The other thing is, they're better off the top in the late game than you would think, just because we have so many lords. So while it's a 1/1 for 1 on turn 1, when we peel Llanowar Elves on turn 5 or turn 6, we probably have multiple lords on the battlefield, so it might be a 3/3 or a 4/4, which means it's okay in the late game just because of how the deck is built. So key piece number 1 to the deck, have a 1-drop mana dork on turn 1, so we can start playing our endless 3-drop lords on turn 2. So our best lord is Elvish Archdruid, gives all our elves +1/+1, but the key text on Elvish Archdruid is you can tap it to add a green for each elf you control. So that gets out of control really quick. When we have a 1-drop on turn 1, Elvish Archdruid on turn 2, there's a good chance that on turn 3 we're going to play 2-3 spells, sometimes even more than that. When we have an Elvish Archdruid on turn 2, we are very likely to win the game if we untap with it. Then we have the Elvish Champion Nylea's Presence Wombo combo. So if you've seen a Merfolk deck play, one of the things they like to do is Spreading Seas one of your lands to make it an island, and then use their Island Walk Lords to make all their creatures unblockable, which is a pretty reasonable plan, and it works pretty well for Merfolk. So we can kind of do the same thing with Elves, with Elvish Champion and Nylea's Presence. So Nylea's Presence enchants a land, you draw a card when it enters the battlefield, and enchanted land becomes every basic land type in addition to its other type. So every basic land type means it is a forest, among other things. Elvish Champion is a literal Lord of Atlantis as a 3-mana elf. Gives all other elves +1/+1 and Forest Walk, just like Lord of Atlantis gives all of their merfolk +1/+1 and Island Walk. So we can play Nylea's Presence, we get to draw a card when it enters the battlefield, just like Spreading Seas, turn a land into a forest, play an Elvish Champion, then suddenly, no matter what blockers our opponent has, we can swing through and deal a ton of damage thanks to the Elvish Champion. Then we have Jorga Warcaller and Imperious Perfect. Jorga Warcaller is really sweet because it lets us abuse the mana we can produce with all of our 1-drops, with our Elvish Archdruids. Our deck can make a lot of mana sometimes, and Jorga is our payoff. So it is a lord that has multi-kicker, so it can be multiple lords all in one. So we can play it as a 1/1 for 1, or we can pay the kicker of 1 and a green, which would make it a 2/2 for 1 and 2 green, and it enters with a +1/+1 counter, and other elves get +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Jorga. So at 3 mana, it gives all our other elves +1/+1, and it's a 2/2, exactly like other elf lords. Where it gets crazy, though, is when we can make 5, 7, 9, 11 mana with our mana dorks and our elvish archdruids, and then it's giving all of our elves +3/+3, +4/+4, +5/+5. There are definitely times when we play a Jorga and all of a sudden our elves are 9 power and we just win the game on the spot. So that's the cool thing about Jorga, is it just offers a lot of flexibility. Imperius Perfect, I just wanted to test it out. It might be better as just a 4th Jorga, but it is an elf lord and it is a pretty sweet one. But in this deck, it seems like I rarely wanted to be spending my time tapping my elves. I wanted to be attacking with them. So it's pretty much just other elves you can control get +1/+1. I guess you could get in a situation where it's in the late game and top deck battles and you peel an Imperius Perfect and you want to start making tokens. But the deck, in my experience with it, you're either going to win in the early games or lose in the early games. There's so much power in this deck that you're going to trample over your opponent really quickly, unless they can wrath your board, and then you're probably going to lose, or if they have like multiple bolts and stuff. So that's how this deck plays out. So the tap, pay a green, and make a 1/1 just doesn't seem relevant very often. Speaking of relevant lords, Azuri isn't really a lord because it doesn't pump our creatures, but it is kind of a lord. Another 2/2 for 3. You can pay a green to regenerate another target elf. That's a really key ability to protect against the lightning bolts and anger of the gods and all that kind of stuff. And then it has an overrun for elves built in. You pay 2 and 3 green, and elf creatures that we control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. So that's another good way of closing out the game. The Forest Walk Nylea's Presence combo is one way that we close out the game through opposing blockers. And the +3/+3 and trample, the overrun on Azuri, is the other way we close out the game, even through a bunch of blockers. And then the rest of our elves, our non-lord elves, Dwynen's Elite and Elvish Visionary, these are just 2-drops, and they generate a decent amount of value for what they do. So Dwynen's Elite comes in with 3 power and 3 toughness because you get a 1/1 elf warrior token when it enters the battlefield, and it works really well with our lords. It gives us 2 bodies that are pumped by all of our lords. And then Elvish Visionary doesn't cost us a card. It's only a 1/1 for 2, not too huge, but when we have multiple lords, it's a 3/3 or 4/4, and it replaces itself with another card, which helps us draw more lords and more action. And then the last card in the deck, our refuel card, is Lead the Stampede. So we dump our hand pretty fast in this deck with so many mana dorks, and then Lead the Stampede because our deck is super focused on creatures. Our deck has 18 lands, 8 spells, the 4 Nylea's Presence, 4 Lead the Stampede, and the whole rest of the deck, so 34, 36, something like that, 34 I believe, are creatures. So with Lead the Stampede, we are often hitting 3 cards, sometimes hitting even 4 cards, and when we're drawing 3 or 4 creatures for only 3 mana, it's a really good way to refuel. It helps us refuel after Wrath, which no other card in our deck really does. And it just helps us find more lords and find the finishing lords, the Azuri and the champion, to actually push through that final damage. Mana base, as I mentioned, 18 Forest, really simple. In the sideboard, 4 Rapid Vigor, regenerate each creature you control, 2 mana green instant. This is to protect us against Pyroclasm, against Anger of the Gods, Supreme Verdict, all of those Wrath effects, which are pretty devastating for our deck. Then we have some specific hate. We have Choke to deal with decks that are playing islands. And Skylasher also can come in those matchups. It's not an elf, but it has flash, it can't be countered, it has reach and protection from blue. And then Grafdigger's Cage can help against Dredge, but the main reason it's in our deck is to fight against getting Emrakul from Nahiri. And then Chameleon Colossus, good against black decks. We have so much mana that it's not unrealistic that we can make it an 8/8 or even a 16/16 on turn 5, just because we can produce a ton of mana. And with Pro Black, it can swing in and just finish off our opponent. And then the 3 Reclamation Sages to just deal with artifacts and enchantments. And that is Beatdown Elves in Modern. So I think the deck's pretty sweet. It's definitely unique, and one of the things I really like about it is very upgradable. So we are playing a very budget version of Elves, but there are even more competitive or expensive versions that you can build into from this foundation. Looking at the cards in this deck, you would play a high percentage of them in a non-budget version of Modern Elves. There's some substitutions. Heritage Druid, Nettle Sentinel is the big package to produce a ton of mana, and then instead of Lead the Stampede, you play Collected Company. So there's things you can do like that, and we'll talk about that in the article. But that's one of the things I like about this deck, is I think it is playable as it is, but it's also very upgradable into an even more competitive deck. So I'm excited about it. I like when that works out, and we have budget decks that are not just good budget decks, but budget decks that can become good non-budget decks as well, with some key upgrades. Anyway, make sure to check out the website, mtggoldfish.com. Decks, prices, metagame strategy, pretty much anything and everything you could want related to Magic the Gathering. And if you enjoyed the video, take a minute and click the like button and the subscribe button that are about to pop up on the bottom of your screen. Not only will it keep you up to date on all the latest and greatest video content here on mtggoldfish.com, but it's also a big favor to us. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy our Beatdown Elves budget magic in Modern, and I will talk to you soon.